Wow, do we have some great driving tips and secrets for you today. On this episode of the Speed Secrets podcast is one of those drivers who knows how to go fast, win races, and coach other drivers. It's Spencer Pumpelly. We talk about everything from rotating the car to flying helicopters, and some really good fluff at the end. Believe me, the fluff is the best stuff. Hello and welcome to another show. Today's guest has won just about everything that he's driven. It seems that there are drivers who just know how to win. They're fast, but they know how to win. And there are drivers who are fast, but don't know how to win. And today's guest, Spencer Pumpelly, is one of those guys that just, I don't know. Spencer, I don't know how you do it, but you seem to win in everything that you get your hands on. And we can talk about that if you're okay with that. So, welcome to the show.
Well, first off, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the vote of confidence there. When you hear about me winning races, it's because it popped up in an article or you read about it on a website. But a lot of times you don't hear about it when I lose, and I certainly have lost my fair share as well. But I appreciate it, and thanks. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation. This is a fun podcast to be on.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, right? The great thing about racing is, or the bad thing about racing, one of the two is there's only one winner. And that means everybody else is technically a loser.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to explain that to my 6-year-old son, how, you don't have to win all the time. Daddy loses more than he wins. It's just a numbers game. But, I have been fortunate enough to win some big races and be with good teams, good co-drivers, good mechanics, good engineers. If you want to know the speed secret, that's it. Work with good people.
Yeah.
It begins and ends there.
So I'm curious, and first of all, we were talking just before we got going here, but how many years it's been that you and I have been at tracks and we say hello to each other, but we've never really had a conversation like this. So it's weird how we get to the track and we get in our own little world and never get a chance to talk to other people.
Yeah, it's amazing how the paddock is filled with people I know, I see all the time, yet I'll go weeks and weeks of sharing the same little square acre as they do, yet never see them except for maybe, out in the track as we pass each other or, maybe bump into each other at the airport. We spend a lot of time with our buddies and our competitors, yet completely oblivious to what they're doing because we're so focused on kind of the issues and the challenges at hand that each race weekend brings. So it is nice to talk. I want to say I did my first pro race in 1998. It was the Daytona 24 Hours.
That was your first pro race?
That was, yeah.
Wow.
I know you didn't was that old. And it was, I'm sure you were in that race as well.
Yep.
And so we've been sharing the racetrack for a long time. But this is probably the longest we've talked in about 20 years. And I'm glad we got the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I've had longer, more in-depth conversation with fellow racers, drivers at airports. We seem to be, standing around waiting to get onto the same plane. There's that one flight that leaves after the race that every racer flies from or roars away from the track to try to catch. And we're all standing in line now to get on the plane. And that's where you spend most of your time talking to drivers.
Yeah, absolutely. The terminal at Atlanta, as everyone's either leaving their base in Atlanta, which is basically half the paddock, to all the guys traveling and connecting through Hartsfield. It's that seems to be the after parties of current day. I remember when my dad was racing, he was racing GTP cars, and there was always be some sort of crazy party every weekend with women and fast cars and probably illegal substances. And nowadays it's hanging out at the airport waiting for security.
Waiting for security to get home to our family and then go hit the gym to get ready for the next one.
Yeah, exactly. And
different
do
world.
it all over again. It is. Yeah, that's one interesting thing about car racing is that, I live two completely different lives and they just seamlessly kind of integrate, and one switch flips off and the other one switches on. I'll be, helping get little kids dressed and wiping rear ends, and then the next thing you know, I'll be blasting down the Mulsanne at Le Mans and staying in some crazy French chateau, and just spending hours in airports and rental cars and hotels. So it's an interesting life we live.
Yeah,
and I always say I wouldn't trade it for anything. I really enjoy what I've done, but there are often times when it just feels a little weird, to be honest.
I thought you were going to say that when you were getting people dressed and wiping rear ends, then you had to go home and work with your kids.
Exactly. That was, yeah.
Other than working with your co-driver. So, yeah, that's interesting. So talk to us about, actually, you got started because of your family. Is that how you got involved with the sport, or you've always been involved with the sport, right?
My dad was a driver, and I want to say when I was he started racing before I was born, and he had a pretty big crash when I was about a year old, maybe a year and a half, and that kind of got him thinking that maybe this wasn't such a smart idea. And this was back in the 70s, so racing was a whole lot more dangerous, and guys were getting killed on a regular basis. As he ran Formula Atlantic, ran some Formula Fords. But it wasn't until 82 when he did the Daytona 24 in a Ferrari 512 BB that I actually really remember going to the track.
Wow.
And I was
what a car.
Young then. Yeah, it was really a neat car. It had more of a sedan look, even though it raced in the prototype class. And that was kind of where my interest, or maybe my love for the sport started. And then he once again got back into IMSA in the late 80s. And he did a full season in a Ford Zaxbyt Pro GTP car. So here I was at age 12, 13, going to all these races and all these cool locales like Miami and Watkins Glen and just kind of hanging out in that paddock. And a lot of people think it was a heyday. I doubt it was quite as cool as it is right now. But, from my memory at age 13, that life didn't get any cooler than being a race car driver in IMSA. So I started looking into how I could get involved in, when I first got my driver's license. And I always thought that he and I would probably buy a car and we'd go do some racing, but he had other ideas. He just, figured I would hurt myself and end up poor and broke. So he really didn't want to have anything to do with that. So I ended up going to Skip Barber, unbeknownst to him. I took back all my Christmas gifts one year and just finally got a wad of cash big enough to go, which is it's tough to find any cash when you're a college student.
Yeah.
But I was able to do that. I kind of talked my way into a couple of race weekends. And then when the money dried up, I got a job instructing for Skip Barber. And as much as I learned as a driver from going to Skip, and this is when Skip, I want to say, was probably at its peak, the largest fields in amateur racing each weekend, some of the best instructors, all the guys that you hear of racing Indy cars, nowadays they were all racing there. We had just such a strong group of people. But I learned a whole lot more as an instructor teaching people than I did as a student there. And so that's kind of how I got started. I also met the first guy that really put me in a competitive pro car, Steve Ivankovich. And he came as a student to a school I was teaching. And then we ended up running 3 years with Steve running the show and Zip Racing. And that got me, in front of guys like Cole Scroggum and Kevin Buckler and some of the other guys I ended up driving for down the road, Mike Levitas. So that's kind of how I started. And I never really raced much outside of sports cars, but sports car racing is kind of really what I've been focused on and where I still enjoy racing today.
So it's interesting. I mean, you're not one of those guys that at 5 years old was at a go-kart every weekend, right?
So I grew up in Northern Virginia, and the concept of a go-kart, I mean, that's something you built in your backyard to drive around the neighborhood. There was absolutely, or they were, at the beach next to the mini golf course. That was all I knew about go-karting. And you think nowadays, well, wow, how couldn't you go online and look and learn more about it? Well, we didn't have the internet or things like that. I literally didn't know what go-karting was through my high school years, my childhood age. The first time I got in a race car, I was 19, and that was in the Skip Barber 3-day school.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think it's cool that there are some people that go, if you didn't grow up driving go-karts since you were 5, you could just never make it anywhere. And you and some other drivers have proven that that's not necessarily the case.
No, so I don't really know much about go-karting. I still to this day haven't done a lot of it. I do know that it beats me up, and I always worry about my ribs.
Yeah.
After a day of the go-kart track, I wonder, if the risks aren't somehow, outpacing the rewards, but it's just not something that's really close or accessible. But, when I was with Skip Barber, we had a lot of drivers come through the ranks that were karting, stars and standouts. And for every AJ Allmendinger or Joey Hand or Patrick Long or someone who was very successful in karts, Skip then promoted up through the ranks. What he doesn't tell you is we had about 30 of them come through that just couldn't figure out the car at all. And I think my knowledge base of go-karting is based on watching karters, successful karters, come in and try to drive race cars and see what it is they try to do. We had one student that took a Skippy car on the autocross and just right out of the box. I mean, this is a first gear autocross that, maybe top speed was 40 miles an hour. And they just never lifted in turn one, thinking they could just crank the wheel and go around the track like they do in a kart, and went flying off and almost made it to the fence, which is, must have been a quarter mile away. So there was a lot. I think that karting is, from what I can tell from the outside, karting is very good for some aspects of driving. And then, especially if you get into sedan racing, it can lead to some bad habits in other areas. But I have to say, my 6-year-old kid, who I don't really have any aspirations that he becomes a driver. I want him to become what he wants to become, and I want to help him any way I can. But we did put him in a kart about 3 weeks ago for the first time, and he had a blast. So my karting knowledge may grow here in the future as I get sucked into it. We'll see.
As your bank account goes down, your knowledge will go up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And I mean, you said that there are some karters that, especially if they're going to race production-based cars, they have some bad habits. What are some of those that you've seen?
From the Skippy standpoint, what I've noticed about karters and the little karting I've done that makes sense, one of the things is they're not very good on the brake pedal. And that makes sense. You're kind of just stabbing it in karting, whereas in the car, you spend a lot more time on the brake pedal. But I think one of the biggest things is that, so I guess it's two things. One is that in the car, how you release the brake and how you kind of rotate the car into the corner is very important. When I'm racing a sedan, I want to turn my hands in, I want to trail the brake, and as the front starts to gain grip as I come off the brake, and the rear's still kind of light because it's been up in the air as I've been braking, there's a little magic window where the car wants to rotate, and my hands are going to unwind as a result. Now, I'm not going to opposite lock, but I'm certainly not going to have a ton of steering in it. And the only way to get that rotation is by trailing the brake effectively. Whereas when I watch the karters, I see that two things. One is they all want to try to induce oversteer with the steering wheel, which, in a go-kart, I believe you can do because the caster angle tends to jack up the inside rear wheel, and now you only have a one tire in the back doing any work, you have two in the front. And you can actually slide the car with the steering wheel. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but that's kind of what it appears. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a race car, all you can do with the steering wheel is get understeer. So that's one big difference. But the other thing is, too, I feel like in a car, especially in a sedan, you really need to have the rear slide a little bit more to point the front. And in a go-kart, every time I've slid the car, it tends to slow me down a lot. So you've got to be willing to make that transition from, keeping the thing tighty to hanging the rear out a little bit. And I think for a lot of people that have been karting a long time, that's a tough transition to make. So again, those are my observations. I don't know how accurate it is, but from what I see, that's what the karters tend to fight. But the karters that adapt and have the racecraft, that bring in the ability to kind of slow the world down and use their eyes, and have the kind of the battle-tested nerves to go wheel-to-wheel racing, they tend to do a really good job if they can adapt.
Wow, I could not agree more. Especially the part about getting the car to rotate, and there's that moment there where you you go to almost neutral steering, right? And it's just, open your hands, get the wheels pointing straight, and then you can commit to throttle. And that's when the magic really happens. And I get that with the karters is, they come in and they kind of flick the wheel to try to induce something. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can all that's going to do is just induce a bunch of understeer at a production-based car, right? Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And as my friend learned in the skid pad or the autocross, you got to slow down every now and then. Yeah. Well, and that's interesting. I mean, again, kind of going back to that, we tend to hear about the success stories, right? So we hear about the Patrick Longs and the Allmendingers and guys like that. But for every one of those, how many didn't make it? So I think that's, that's super interesting. And the champion of Brazil came through, Skip Barber one week. And then the next week we had the other champion from Brazil. And then the next week we had the other champion from Brazil. I realized that, there's a lot of champions from Brazil.
that in go-karts. Anyway,
yeah.
That was always pretty funny.
Yeah. Hey, just because you've also, I mean, you've driven. First of all, you're racing with Magnus this year.
Yeah, so I've actually got a really exciting season this year. I'm driving the long races with Magnus. So I'm doing the NAC, Daytona, Sebring, 6 Hour, and Petite. And that's with my good friend Andy Lally, and I've driven with Magnus in the past in World Challenge, and that's in a Lamborghini. So the car is not dissimilar from what I ran in 2016 with Change Racing, and then 2017 with Magnus when they ran the Audi in World Challenge. And then I'm also running a brand new GT4 car in the World Challenge Sprint category with the Racers Group. And that's a team I drove for 6 years from 2007 through 12. And still have a good relationship with Kevin and Deborah Buckler and Weston, the guy that runs that car. And I've got a couple other guys that are going to be teammates, even though they're not going to be running the sprint race, that I look forward to kind of working with and helping along if I can. And so that should be exciting as well. So yeah, I'm in Porsches and Lamborghinis.
Doesn't sound too bad. It's one of those things when, you're sitting on the plane, somebody says to you, what do you do? And you say, I drive race cars. And they go, what do you drive? And you go, Porsches and Lamborghinis. Sounds kind of cool, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, we always joke about the questions that they always ask. I try to say, I'm a consultant. I travel a lot. Try not to get down those roads, but
it's funny. I do this same thing on airplanes. If somebody says, what do you do? The last thing you want to do is mention something about racing, because the rest of your flight has just been ruined.
Yep. And the first question is always the same.
How fast do you go?
No, that's two. Number one is it like NASCAR?
Well, yeah.
Do you race against Dale Gordon?
Yeah.
And then the second one is how fast do you go? And then the third one's did you have a wreck? And then the fourth one's where do you go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
In that order every time.
Yeah.
Like clockwork.
Yeah, exactly.
But I hate to think that I don't want to enjoy sharing what I do with curious people, because I really do enjoy it and I like talking about it. But sometimes I wonder if it's just a conversation filler. And then they always tell you about their uncle that used to drag race back in the 80s at I-42 Speedway in Tuscaloosa or whatever.
And I have a cousin that's got a Camaro too, right?
Yeah. Every time.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, nothing. I had nothing bad about somebody, and you want to share that kind of stuff, but. I don't know about you, but there are times when you get on an airplane with all the travel that we do, you get on an airplane, you kind of just want to go, okay, this is my own little world now. I just want to kind of shut off from the world, and it's my private time. So,
yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, of all the races, all the championships, all the things that you've done, what are one or two or some of them that you are sort of most satisfied with?
I tell you, every time you get a chance to go to Le Mans, that's a special thing. It's not so much the race is fantastic. The track is awesome. You're always in a fast car there. The RSR that I drove there last year is quicker than anything else I'll drive for a long time. And then you think of all the Daytonas and each one, how it's a story in and of itself. It's an adventure. It's a journey. It's got plot twists. It's got, hopes and despair and, elation and tension and nerves and hopefully, has a happy ending, but it's not guaranteed. But in my career, when I was working with TRG back in 2009, they had ventured into NASCAR, and Bobby Labonte was driving their Sprint Cup car, and there was an issue with whether Bobby was going to continue under the situation that was presented. The car wasn't the best. They were one car team. They were new, and as much as they were doing the best they could, that's a steep hill to climb to just jump right in and go Sprint Cup racing, or I guess now it's Monster Energy. So they asked me if I could try to get my road course license, and I did. But the guys at NASCAR said, unfortunately, what we need to see in order to give you the license is some experience in similar cars on similar tracks, of which I really didn't have any. So the decision was made to put me in an ARCA race in one of the Racers Group's ARCA cars, and it was in New Jersey. So in 2009, I got to run ARCA. And before we went to go race the car, we tested it at Kershaw. And so we drove to Kershaw. I hopped in. I took the car out of the pits, and right away you'd hit the gas. And are you still there?
Yep.
Sorry, my cat just stepped on the keyboard. You hit the gas and the wheels would just spin. I came back in and said, guys, I think the clutch might be slipping. I mean, there's no way this thing could have that much power. And sure enough, they all laughed at me. No, you're fine. Go back out. And there had been black marks around the entire length of Kershaw, except for the brake zones. That thing just had so much power that you really couldn't use any of it. You'd have to short shift in first gear at 5,500 RPM, half throttle at most. Wow. Same thing in second gear. You would short shift second, never get even close to full throttle. And finally, about halfway through the run up through third, you could commit to full throttle, which would take you right to fourth. And then that would take you right to the end of the straightaway. And then the racing, I ended up getting in a shoving match with Justin Lofton after there was some miscommunication between our pits. When they said, we're racing the championship, please respect us. What Buckler told me was that they're going to let me by. What they meant to say was, don't pass us. We're trying to win the championship. That got a little confusing there at the end, and we ended up getting together. But we had a ton of fun. I think Pat Long actually won that race, but we were able to lead a lot of it. In the last pit stop with about 6 to go, we dropped a lug nut, went from first to sixth. I was able to get back up to third. But that to me, one reason was it was just a lot different, so that there was a challenge. Yeah. But the other thing was it was fun driving a car with that much power. And, I felt like I was really driving the car the whole time and really racing the guys I was around. So I really enjoyed that.
It's so cool when you get to drive a car that's got more power than grip.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If it was up to me, all these GT3 cars, I mean, the tires would be half the size, the downforce would be gone, and the motors would be unlimited. Or we wouldn't be restricting them down to 400 horsepower when they're 700 horsepower engines.
It's funny how I think every driver, that's what they want. I mean, even in Formula One, I think you ask Formula One drivers, they go, less downforce, less grip, more horsepower.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nobody listens to us.
No, absolutely. And, nowadays you get, halfway down the straightaway in the Lamborghini and it just stops going. You just sit there, 162 miles an hour or whatever it does because it's just trying to push through the wind. But the braking is, it's unbelievable now, considering when I first started racing Sebring, where I had the brakes in the Porsche, R or GT3R in 2003 versus now. I mean, it's less than half of the brake zone. The things just stop. Wow. So yeah, I enjoyed it when we were doing a little bit more sliding and you had to really drive the thing. And now a lot of times I feel like we're just steering it, but that's the challenge that's ahead of us. And that's what you have to kind of learn how to be good at.
And I've heard the argument, that, okay, let's say the brake zone is half the distance. It used to be that if you were 1% better than somebody else, if the brake zone was twice as long, you had that advantage. Now you've got to be twice as good to make a pass because it's half the distance. Does that make any sense?
It does. That's beyond my quick math. Yeah. I think I know what you're saying. And, especially now that we have ABS, it's kind of hard to not be as good as your competitor in the brake zone. And I still tell, this actually brings up a good point for your listeners, but I tell my guys all the time that I coach that the passing is finished in the brake zone, but you can never start it in the brake zone if it's a competitive situation. If you're not at least, getting to the bumper or creeping, or if you're just deciding you're going to pop out of line, break deeper than someone who's your equal, bad things are going to happen. And that's even true with ABS now. It all happens in a shorter distance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But the other thing about, we kind of go, okay, the application of the brake, even with ABS, it's just kind of pound on it and let it do its work. But still, as you touched on earlier, what you do when you get to the corner and how you release it ABS doesn't help you there.
True, I agree. And I also think there's a technique with ABS that I find. I used to get yelled at in the ST car because my brake pressures were too high. I would, double what the rest of the team was doing. But I was a big believer in that car. And I don't know if it's always true across the board, but I've always been a big believer that the more pressure you put in the ABS system, that the quicker it's going to get back to slowing the car before it dumps again. And I found that if you can add a little bit of extra pressure and hold it for the straight line portion of the braking, you can actually take the brake zone down a little more than your competitors that are happy just to kind of get to the ABS and wait. There are certain tracks, like I want to say like Laguna, that doesn't have a lot of grip. Sometimes it's actually better to get to the ABS than dial back and let the tires roll. But in most situations, I'm a big believer in going to a pretty big pedal, and the quicker you can get there, the better. And that leaves a little bit of technique for a driver, in ABS. Now, my good friend and co-driver Andy Lally will disagree. He likes to smoothly roll out of the gas and smoothly roll into the brake, and he goes just as fast as I do. So who knows how he's making that work? But I still think with ABS, there's some technique involved.
Yeah,
the one thing that if you think back to when we first started driving, especially at Daytona, the team owners that needed good drivers needed drivers that were fast and that wouldn't damage the car. But now you can't over rev it on the downshift. Now you can't flat spot the tire. Now you can't miss an upshift and stick it in third gear when you meant to go to fifth. And there's a lot of things that you just can't do anymore. That doesn't make it any easier to drive, but it makes it harder to make a big mistake that can end your race.
Yeah, great point. And so you bring up Andy, who's another guy who just, I don't know how Andy does it. Sometimes you kind of go, how does that guy just seem to get in the winning car all the time? Well, sometimes he co-drives with you. I guess that's part of it. But what is it that you have seen some of the best co-drivers that you've had? What do they do differently or better or that than some of the co-drivers who will say are less than best? What's the difference?
On-track driving, as far as the technique that we use to make the car fast, when I work with some of the best drivers in the world, I find that everyone has a very similar approach. You can pretty much overlay the brake trace and the throttle trace, and even the speed trace will be the same, and the brake and throttle will all be the same as well. I don't see a big variation in the way drivers at kind of Andy's level attack the driving. That's not to say they're all the same, but to me, it's pretty similar. The biggest difference I noticed a guy like Andy Lally is I think he's got a street smart, if you will, that he brings to the backside of the team, to the how we work in the debriefs, how we work in prep, how we kind of get the car ready to be the best car that it's going to be. Andy seems to have the ability to not only drive it fast, and he's got every bit of aggression and desire to win, and he's not afraid of anybody, but he's also really street smart when it comes to how the team operates. Book smarts are good for engineers, but drivers with street smarts like Andy, and I'm trying to think of a good example, but he always just kind of knows what the car needs next, and kind of knows which direction to point the guys and why. And a lot of times he'll think of things that I don't think of, and I think, oh wow, that's great. Why didn't I think of that? And that's why Andy's so good.
Put you on the spot here. Who's the best co-driver you've ever had?
Best co-driver I've ever had. Gosh, I mean, I've been pretty impressed with a lot of different people for a lot of different ways. I want to say pace-wise, I drove with Nick Tandy at Le Mans, and was just, I mean, it's not often that a co-driver will just go faster than me, and I'll just look at the data and just say I can't do it. He knew that car really well, and it was kind of new to me, but at the same time, I kind of knew what I was leaving on the table. He was getting more out of it than what I thought. So I was really impressed with him. Sorry, that was Patrick Pilet. I'm sorry, I get my European Porsche drivers confused. Yeah. Patrick Pilet in 2012 when we ran together, he took our AM car and out-qualified all the pro Porsches, even though that was a year newer car. Give you an idea of his pace.
Wow.
You know who else really impressed me was in 2009. That was the same year I was doing the NASCAR stuff. Earlier in the year, we brought Bobby Labonte to drive with us at Daytona.
Yeah.
And while he didn't have the pace that the Porsche factory guys did, we had Pilet, no, not Pilet, Dumas,
yeah.
Collard, Wolf Hensler, myself, Andy Lally, and there might have even been another factory guy like Leitz or something in there, all driving TRG cars. And I remember first day of the Roar was the only day he could do. And I want to say like Wolf got down to a 50.1 and the rest of us were kind of in the mid 50s. And Bobby's first stint in the car, not on even new tires, he got down to a 50.8.
Wow.
So to be within just kind of a spattering of tenths to some of the best Porsche drivers and the most experienced Porsche drivers in the world. And, he had a really good approach too. I thought he was a big time celebrity, and everyone was there to kind of check him out, but he wasn't so passive that he just said, "Hey guys, do it. I'll do what you tell me to." And that's it. He was willing to kind of put his 2 cents in, but certainly, was there to learn, and he did a great job. Now, unfortunately, he was in the car when it ran out of gas, but he got blamed for that too. But I think there was a lot of different things that failed. When you have a car that's got a 4-lap lead and it's out on track and it runs out of gas, and you only have 5 hours to go to win the 24. Yeah, Bobby could have done something different, but so could have. There's other little steps. There should be some checks in your procedure that don't let one person make one mistake to throw away a 24 win.
I think, and I love the fact that you brought that up, because I think, there is a snobbiness about a lot of road racers who look at NASCAR and go, those guys, they only turn left. What do they know? I've had a chance to spend some time at the track with Bill Elliott years ago, and I've worked with some of I've got 4 drivers that I've coached. They're all in Cup right now, like William Byron and Eric Jones and Bubba Wallace and Daniel Hemrick. I've coached all those guys, and they're way better than we give them credit for.
So absolutely. And I think you've seen that with some other drivers come and drive in our series. I used to think that, NASCAR was easy when I first started watching racing and, when I was a kid, but it doesn't take long of being around that paddock and the level of sophistication that they bring to, what we think is ancient technology, but the tools, the procedures, kind of what they use to make that quote ancient technology go fast is in some ways Formula One level stuff. They really they operate on such a high and such a precise level in every aspect of what they do that I've always been really impressed. And I've always thought that the road racing community has way more to learn from them than they would ever learn from us. Those guys race every weekend. And like, for example, they just say the car's tight. And that's because they're saying it all the time in and out. And, understeer is not efficient in their world.
Yeah.
And it's not because they're lazy. It's just they operate on a different level.
It's funny you mentioned that as a bunch of years ago. I can't remember how long ago that was. Well, it was when Colin Brown was driving in NASCAR for Roush. And I had gone to England to do some work, and a friend got me a tour of the Mercedes Formula One factory. We went in there on a Monday night. Everybody was gone, got the whole full tour of the place, walked through Ross Braun's office, went down and looked at that time it was Michael Schumacher and Nico Rosberg's chassis sitting there up, stripped down, look at them, going through the factory, looking at the autoclave, all this stuff. And about a week or two later, I was in Charlotte with Colin, and he took me on a tour of the Roush factory, or the shop. And it was like, you know what? This is just as impressive. It's just some parts are a lot bigger. That's about it.
It is. Yep.
It's really fascinating.
With everything they do to put those cars on the track, and as high stakes as it is, if there were better guys out there to drive them, they'd find them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I always looked at their talent levels. And gosh, I would certainly love to give it a shot and try some ovals. But I'm not going to think that some snooty road course racer is going to have any shot at some of the talent out there for sure.
Well, and I think that's another point. The oval racing that I've done made me a much better road racer. If road racers ever get a chance to get on an oval track, you got to go and do it. Not just the racecraft, but the precision and just the thinking of releasing the car and letting it run free, all those kinds of things that, we learn eventually in road racing. But one of the things that you mentioned is just those guys are racing every single weekend. You're going to learn more.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, Spencer, helicopters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I hear you're getting your license.
Yeah, so I'm going through training right now, which is way cool to be an absolute beginner again. Where are you at?
That's funny because one of the things I really enjoyed being a helicopter pilot and a student again was that it gave me a ton of perspective on what my students are going through when I'm coaching them in race cars.
Yeah.
I think for racing coaches, that's good. That's good to kind of remind yourself and flip the tables and just get that fresh perspective. I got my helicopter license. I started training in 2004. I think I got my ticket in 2005.
Yeah.
And then about 6 years later, I went ahead and got my commercial as well. And I'm not flying currently. I don't really have any need to, but I've certainly considered getting my license, my helicopter license. And I've done some cool stuff before, but it's probably the most challenging and the most rewarding thing I've done to date. And I still, look at every helicopter I see flying overhead with a little bit of jealousy. It's such a neat thing, and I think it's really good for your brain and your soul.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I flew a helicopter, I went, "Oh, this is the closest thing to driving a race car that I've ever done." Not from a speed risk perspective or anything like that, but from a coordination of skills and your hands and your feet and your brain and all of that coordination that it takes. It's just a very cool challenge.
Coordination, eye positioning it's exactly the same as driving a race car. If you think about trying to stay ahead of the chopper, kind of always knowing what's coming up next, and it's very important to have that skill when you're driving a race car and try to be ahead of the car and anticipate as opposed to react. Even just the discipline it takes to, pick up a chopper and move it from point A to point B without, breaking any rules or causing undue risk. I think that the two are really, what's the word? They're very similar in how you have to approach both. And you're right. In a chopper, you don't say, okay, I'm going to go try to find the limit and, push as many G's as possible. You're trying to have a safe flight. In racing, it's the opposite. You're pushing it all the time. But take that out of it. I think the two are very similar and they're good for each other.
Yeah, that was what I was going to sort of ask you was in a race car, the idea is to get as close to that limit and stay as close to there and even go beyond it every now and then to test that. Whereas in flying, it seems like it's all about how big a margin can you build. Exactly.
That is very true. But at the same time, I think the discipline is the key. And when you can kind of practice having a sort of disciplined approach, despite the fact that it's noisy and you're blowing all around with the wind gusts and the radio chatter is going crazy. The fact that you can keep that focus is very similar to having to make decisions in a race car while, dash lights are flashing at you and the pit's asking you questions and, the smoke's pouring out of the back. And there's certain situations where, it doesn't even matter what it is. You're having to be the pilot in command and operate accordingly. So where are you in your flying? How many hours have you done?
Just beginning. So I'm going to say half to 2/3 of the way through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you sold yet?
Pardon me?
Have you soloed yet?
I have not, but it's about to start here any moment. So
do you have a fixed wing license?
No.
No, me either.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of people go, you're just going to jump into a helicopter without doing the fixed wing thing. And then I've had other people say it's actually an advantage to do that.
Yeah. I don't know because I haven't done a lot of fixed wing, but I do know that when you do take that thing off for the first time without the instructor, and you pull the collective, put the nose down, get through ETL, pick it up, it's about 50 feet above the ground when you realize that I'm pretty committed here. You have the controls. It's just not an option anymore. So there are a few things that you will feel that committed to in your life, and it's a spooky but really rewarding feeling.
The other thing that got me was that, I'm flying the Robinson R22, very light. I mean, what are they, 883 pounds or something like that?
830 empty.
Yeah, and My instructor says the first time that he's not in the helicopter with me, the first time I take off, it's just going to feel completely different. I mean, I got to do all this weight balance stuff and everything, but just the impact that weight of another person makes.
And you're going to think you're going to run out of forward travel because without the instructor in there, the nose is a lot higher, so you're having to put a little bit more cyclic to the front. So when I first took off, I thought something might be wrong. I mean, I've never had the cyclic this far forward before. But it's just how it is. And then when I was flying, I also made a bunch of mistakes on my first real solo flight. I picked it up and flew in the pattern, and then we did some hover work before that. But the first time I actually tried to go to a different airport, I tuned in the new frequency. I had done everything right, and then I called the tower and reported that I was 5 miles to the northeast. Well, unfortunately, I never hit switch to change frequencies. So I called the old tower. I just left to the southwest and picked up and told them I was now to the 5 miles northeast. And of course, all the time I'm flying into the new tower's airspace without having made contact. And when I finally figured out the problem, I rectified it quickly, but I just told the new tower, sorry, I'm going to go home. And I just flew back and landed. But it was a good eye-opening experience. And my instructor said, hey, a lot of this is, go make mistakes and learn and put yourself in situations where you're challenged. So I'm excited for you. I think you really enjoy it. And
yeah, I'm gonna put that little thanks for sharing that with me, because that's probably one thing that I won't do now because of your story there. So. Yeah. And, again, I think the point that you made, and it's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, is just, I hope it's going to make me a better coach, because it's so cool to go back and think about being a total beginner again. And yeah, just going through the whole process. It's fascinating. I'm having a blast with it.
Yeah. Well, good luck with it. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I have.
I have to admit, though, the studying of all the FAA books and regulations, that part is not so much fun.
Well, okay, so a good way to look at it for me was I was all curious about flying, and I wanted to know everything there was to know. So to me, I enjoyed doing all that because it was new information.
Yep.
When you go get your commercial, you have to kind of relearn that because you'll forget 90% of it because you don't use it flying a helicopter. You don't know how to use a EV-10, or the things that you would use on a cross-country plane trip. I mean, your hands are busy the whole time anyway. You're not going to be messing with a flight computer. So you'll forget, and then you have to relearn it to take your commercial and get that. And that's a whole lot less fun when you're learning it for the second time.
Yeah.
Because that feeling of discovery isn't there.
But I must say that so the ground school stuff is, I'd rather fly, right? But like anybody, given a choice of sitting through the classroom at the Skippy school or driving a race car, what does somebody want to do, right? But especially the stuff about aerodynamics, the aerodynamics of a helicopter are just mind-boggling, fun, fascinating, interesting, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And very important too, by the way.
Yeah. The good thing is from motorsport, we kind of learn the basics of aerodynamics. Everything kind of gets flipped upside down, but just the whole thing of advancing or retreating blades and all that kind of stuff. It's really, really cool. So, yeah. So anybody listening to this, if you're interested in flying helicopters, is where it's at, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a little less practical, but I think it's, there's nothing like taking a chopper and flying between the Bank of America building and the Westin Hotel at the 50-story level in downtown Atlanta.
Yeah.
It's looking at all the poor suckers that are sitting in traffic and not up flying with you. And I tend to be a poor sucker a whole lot more than I'm the guy flying, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a neat experience. And the visibility is unlike anything else either.
The first time that I did an intro flight, I flew past the Space Needle in Seattle, and you're kind of flying by and people are waving at you, and it's like, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And yeah. Well, hey, Spencer, this has been really fun talking about this. And we could talk about, in fact, I'll meet you at a track somewhere and we'll actually have a conversation about helicopters some more. But really cool, the stuff that you've shared here, some of the stuff about brake release and rotating and the difference between karting and cars, some of the stuff about, one of the things that I thought my takeaways was the whole concept or the whole thought around, when you're passing, you finish it in the brake zone, but you start it before the brake zone. I mean, it's in a way that seems like a no-brainer, but I think a lot of drivers just get there and then all of a sudden, last second, stuff it in the inside and think they're going to do it all in that brake zone, and they haven't really thought it out beforehand, and that's why we get dumb crashes going into corners, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see passes in the brake zone all the time. So as someone who watches a lot of racing and then goes and tries it, it makes sense. But I think every good driver knows that that's the end of the pass. The beginning of the pass happens coming off the corner beforehand, and it's set up on the straightaway. And I can pass a lap car doing that, but someone who I'm really competitive in racing with, if I'm still that car length back when we get to that 400 marker where I know I'm going to have to brake no matter what, the car isn't suddenly going to make it to the 300 and stick. That's not going to work.
Yeah. Hey, so can I ask you to share a speed secret, one piece of advice for drivers to help them perform better?
Yeah, I'd certainly love to. The first thing that comes to mind always is eyes, and that's in flying and anything you do. But I'm sure that speed secret's been grounded enough. I was driving for probably 3 years before I really figured out what the instructors meant by keep your eyes up. I thought, bring them up a little bit, but then one day it just kind of clicked. I saw the entire track. Yeah. I saw the big picture. I saw as much of the clouds as I did of the asphalt. I went from focus to big picture, and I still had to focus, believe it or not. But I want to say, for a speed secret for sedan guys, what I always see my drivers do is they tend to overslow the entry. And when they overslow the entry, the first thing they want to do is then they realize it, so they go back to some throttle.
Yep.
And that light little bit of throttle is just enough to lift the front wheels off the ground and make a little bit of understeer. So now they're not going around the corner very well, even though they're slow. And it takes them a long time to then turn and go straight. I like to call that little bit of early throttle fluff. And I don't know what rating your podcast is, but you can get a fluffer as someone that keeps someone ready to go perform. That throttle is just keeping that speed up so that when you're eventually ready to go, you can go. So my speed secret is to try to eliminate the fluff. Try to get it to where you are carrying enough entry speed to where you don't feel like you need to go to throttle until it's time to unwind the hands and go. I spend probably, most of my time with the drivers I coach trying to get them to eliminate the fluff. So my speed secret is no fluffing.
I love it. And it's so I talk about that often as, it's the change of speed problem. You overslow the car, you think, I got some grip. Let me get on the throttle. You get on the throttle, and now you've got the chassis moving around. The car moves, so you believe that you're driving the car at the limit. Mm-hmm. But you've actually created this artificially low limit, right?
Yes.
And you come in, you go, oh, I'm a driving god. Look at me. The car's sliding around going through there, and you're going, yeah, but if you carried 2 miles an hour more, or 5 miles an hour more into the corner, you wouldn't.
Yeah. I think if we have time to talk about the just kind of the three phases of the corner and kind of what I tend to fight. A lot of times if drivers turn late, and I think a lot of the late turning has been, it was certainly the prevailing thought back through, the time I was at Skip Barber, late turn in, late apex will give you the most straightaway speed possible. I think once we really introduced data and mass, we've started to kind of get away from that. And I've certainly been away from that for a really long time. But one thing about entry speed and going in early is it prevents you from going to that early throttle. So when I look at overlays versus me or someone I'm coaching, I very often see that the initial throttle is earlier than mine because I'm still going in fast and slowing down. Mm-hmm. But because I stay on the nose and because that load on the nose is helping the car turn, I'm able to straighten my hands and get to full throttle faster despite going in earlier. And it's all because I did eliminate that fluff.
And it has to do with the only way that you can go in a little earlier is if you really use the brakes to get the car to rotate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go in earlier, the reason why we never used to teach turning in early is because if you didn't realize you were in early, you'd run out of road or crash. Or or at best case scenario, you'd pinch the exit
Yeah.
and kill your straightaway speed. However, I started finding that with some of the faster cars I was driving, it didn't really matter how early I tried to go to power. I wasn't really committing to full throttle in a 500 horsepower car until later in the game. So unless I could drive into that kind of what I call the go point fast, I was just kind of waiting to get there. So I started turning in earlier and just bending my hands just the tiniest little bit as I was still hard on the brake, and then doing a really long, slow, drawn out trade of steering for braking. And I also think when you're trailing the brakes, you have to kind of understand the physics of what's happening. Hard braking means the car can't turn. 100% of the car's tire's ability to turn is being taken up, slowing it down. But when I start to trade and come out of the brake as I turn the car, instantly those front tires start to bite. But it takes a little while for all that load on the nose to settle back down. So I'm taking advantage of a window where those front tires are loaded and getting better and better grip. But if I start to trail the brake before I turn my hands, I've now kind of changed the game. Now I'm starting to unload the front tires before I turn. So it's really important to lead with your hands when you're trail braking and turning the wheel before you start releasing the brake. So the brake release occurs with some slip in the tire. And that's what really helps it point. And if you can do that, you should have your hands to where they've straightened back out. You're not steering into a slide because that's, of course, overdoing it. But you also don't have a lot of wheel staying in. You're trading it. And then as soon as you get that rotation kind of pointing the car where you want to go, and you're able then to unwind your hands, that's when you settle with the throttle and then accelerate hard. And if you don't bring the entry speed in, none of that's possible because you don't have any load on the nose to make it all work. So part of good corner entry is just simply driving the car in. But if you bend it in early and slowly, I think you'll have plenty of room to kind of adjust and fix any mistake. Some of the times when I see guys turn really late, they're turning so far towards the edge of the racetrack that if they do have a little slide, they can be out in the grass pretty easily. And that's never really a good situation to be in when you're trying to press harder and try to find more speed. A good example is the laces at Watkins Glen. I mean, the line I first started driving when I got there had me a foot away from the grass, and there's only 4 feet to the tire wall. So, I'm not going to challenge my brake zone in that situation. But once I started turning in early, I realized that I had a lot I could slide a car with. And of course, that would be too deep. And I would make an adjustment next lap, but I wouldn't be in the tire wall. And so I think, that whole entry phase of the corner and how you, how you slow down, how you trail in, what you're looking for from your feet and hands, it's all part of the deal. And if you get it right, you shouldn't need any of that throttle till it's time to really unwind the hands and go.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole late turn in thing, I think, is overdone. And just geometry tells us the later we turn in, the sharper we have to turn the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I thank you for sharing that, because I totally agree with you. And there are some things, and there are these myths that have hung around for many, many years. And sometimes you need to change those. You need to bust them. Yeah.
I often claim that I invented turning in early as a productive strategy, not as I just made a big mistake. Because I've certainly been watching people turn in early as far as since I've been driving. But when I was working at Skip Barber back in the day, I don't know if you know Stefan Bastricki, but a fantastic driver and a fantastic coach. We would teach on the autocross at the driving school, and the line that we would tell the students to use was so wide on entry, and it definitely straightened up the straightaways, but it just seemed really tight and late. But I assumed since that's what we were teaching, that was the way to go. And one day Stefan was like, "Hey, it's faster if you just go right to the inside." Like, what? Are you serious? Yeah, absolutely. And we tried it, and sure enough, it was. And then I started incorporating that into my driving. I don't think Stefan Bastricki knows how much he helped me in that. But as soon as I started doing that, people would laugh at me. But now I feel like that's kind of the way in the pro stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny how many drivers, I guess, are afraid to experiment with that kind of thing. They get stuck in this. Well, that's the way I was told. I always say, you ask driver, why do you drive that line that you drive? And they, kind of go, well, it's the right way. No, but why do you drive it? Well, that's what Bill taught me.
Mm-hmm.
We drive, instead of driving the line that is right, they just drive the line because somebody told them to drive that line. Yeah.
Yeah. I get that a lot from the students I teach that have done other things that, will come to me and, well, the guy said to do it this way. And, and to be honest, I mean, really, when you're really going quickly, the line, and this is another thing that's hard to explain to new guys, but the line is no longer the cause. It's the result.
Yeah.
It is. The line tells you what you did in the corner. How much speed did you take in? Was it too much? Was it too little? Whereas when you first start, the line is basically everything. But a lot of people do get hung up on certain little bits that they've picked up. And, my driving, I think, even at a place like Sebring, where I've been to a million times, I was just there last week testing, and, I made some adjustments, and as the cars change, as the tires change, as the track changes, there's a lot of, you need to always kind of be experimenting. Might not always work, but you need to never assume that you've got it figured out.
Well, I think that's, if there was one thing that separates the best from the less than best, that's one of them, right? It's the willingness to go and say, I don't know it. I'm going to try that. And also, I guess, having the trust that they can make that adjustment, that experiment, and get away with it. You're going to slide wide, but you're not going to slide into the tire wall.
Exactly. I tell the guys, and that, a lot of the flat out corners, like we'll be going somewhere like, I'm trying to think, like the S's at the Glen. And my guys will say, well, if you do it flat, I saw your data, you did it flat. I just need to go do it flat. I mean, it can be done, so I just need to do it. And I always say, whoa, stop, time out. Two things. One is that I'm confident that if I'm not flat every time. Every now and then I'll get a little wide or something, and I'll have to make an adjustment. And I'm confident that I can recognize that. And then the other thing is I'm confident in my ability to make that adjustment. But if you're not confident in those two things, then you're not ready to go flat. And that voice in your head that's saying, hey, wait a sec, it's always right.
Yeah.
That voice is always right. When you're ready to go faster, it should be natural. It should be easy. It should be calculated. It should be a result of a lot of confidence that you've built up over the past. It shouldn't ever kind of break through that, what do they call it? Spray and pray or whatever.
Yeah.
Mentality.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, Spencer, we got to do this again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this has been hugely fun. How do listeners follow you? Where do they find out what you're doing? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the best way to follow me is on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I can be found. It's at Spencer Pumpelly.
Okay.
That's Pumpelly, and Spencer has a C. And then my Instagram handle is Spencer_Pumpelly. And usually if I Instagram it, it's on Twitter, but not always vice versa.
Right.
But, and then I have a website, SpencerPumpelly.com, which last time I checked wasn't working, but you're certainly willing to check that and hopefully get that back up and running. But for the most part, you can find me in the Magnus car this year for IMSA, and you can find me in the Racers Group Porsche for the Pirelli World Challenge Sprint GT4, and hopefully at a track near you.
Well, good luck this season, all year, and well, forever. But most important, just keep having fun. And thank you for sharing with us today. This has been really cool.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Ross. I look forward to seeing you at the track and maybe spending more than a fleeting hello as we pass by.
Absolutely. Just a quick note that next Tuesday, the 26th, I'm doing a webinar called Mental Prep for Drivers. I hope it's at least half as valuable as the information that Spencer shared today. I'm sure it will be. Go to speedsecrets.com/mental-prep. Again, that's speedsecrets.com/mental-prep for more info and to sign up. Registration closes on the night of the 24th. That's Sunday night. Hey, I'll be back here again next week with another interesting, fun guest. I hope you'll join me. Until then, keep learning and having fun.